Moderator, I have promoted you all, so you should be able to turn on your video and audio, but let me know if you're having any issues. Oh, great, hi, Veena. Awesome, so this panel is industrial work, gig work, and work at the margins. And great, Professor Hébert. So I will let you all get started. Professor Hébert, I'll come on video at about 10 minutes that you have left in the panel and help you parse through some of the Q&A questions we have from the audience, if that sounds good. Okay, thank you all.
So I'm Camille Hébert. I'm a faculty member here at the Moritz College of Law, and I teach employment and labor law subjects, including labor law. And I'm here to first introduce you to our three panelists, who I'm also meeting for the first time, and tell you a little bit about them, and then hopefully moderate questions among them. So first, Rebecca Dixon, I'm going in alphabetical order. No, I'm not going in alphabetical order. I'm going in the order in which they're on my program. Rebecca Dixon earned her JD from the Duke University School of Law, served as a New York State Executive Fellow in the Office of the Governor, where she worked on labor and civil rights policy. She's the Executive Director of the National Employment Law Project, which is a leader in federal workers' rights advocacy and a resource for state and local government movements. Ms. Dixon leads NELP's work in building and contributing to a strong workers' rights movement, seeking to dismantle structural racism, eliminate economic inequality, and build worker power. I'm going to introduce all three and then ask some general questions to start the discussion. Professor Veena Dubal, I hope I got that right, earned her JD and her PhD from the University of California, Berkeley as a professor of law at the University of California at Hastings. Her scholarship focuses on the intersection of law, technology, and precarious work, and she employs empirical methodologies and critical theory to understand the impact of digital technology and emerging legal frameworks on the lives of workers, as well as the role of law and lawyers in solidarity movements. Her doctoral research arose from her work as a public interest attorney and the Berkeley Law Foundation Fellow at the Asian Law Caucus, where she founded a taxi workers project and represented Muslim Americans in civil rights cases. She recently won the UC Hastings Foundation Faculty Award for Outstanding Scholarship based on her work in the gig economy. Tommy Carden earned his A from the University of Chicago, where he did thesis field research on sheltered workshops, which employ tens of thousands of workers at sub-minimum wages. He's the lead organizer at Warehouse Workers for Justice, a worker center based in Chicago. In that capacity, he leads a team of organizers who work to build power in Illinois' massive distribution and logistic industries. He's a co-author of the 2021 January 2021 report on the COVID jungle, Chicagoland's essential food workers and the need for vaccination priority. He has previously worked as a legal analyst at the Washington, D.C. law firm as a volunteer field examiner at the National Labor Relations Board's regional office in Chicago. So I'm going to ask you each a starting question, but I hope you will also fill in any things that I missed sort of in your background. So what I would like to ask sort of each of you, in whatever order you'd like to go in, basically is whether each of you can tell us what brought you to the work with respect to sort of working with gig and precarious workers, and some of your experiences in working to empower these types of workers.
Well, I'm happy to start. I'm suffering a little bit from a post-COVID vaccine, so forgive my lack of clarity if there is some. So I, for the past 7 years, have been doing an embedded ethnography of self-organizing gig workers in California, different groups of self-organizing gig workers. And what brought me to study this sort of precarious workforce was the taxi industry. It takes us way back, but soon after 9/11, when tourism really plummeted, I became interested in the fact that there were certain precarious workers who were sort of having both economic volatility and also were subject to hate violence. So there was a taxi driver in San Francisco, Sukhpal Singh Sodhi, who was murdered while on the job, and I started hanging out in the taxi lot, and those guys, they looked a lot like my dad. I identified with them. I really understood their struggles, but it was the first time I realized that there were low-wage workers in the U.S. who could work 12 hours a day and go home without or with less money than they started the day with. And so I started studying taxi work and organizing, and how it was legally that we had this system of misclassified workers. And that I filed in around 2014 my dissertation, and Uber and Lyft had just started disrupting the taxi industry in San Francisco. I heard taxi drivers say, there are all these bandit tech cabs disrupting our fares. And I thought it was this really silly thing that was going to go away, because who was going to sit in in someone else's car who they didn't know, that wasn't regulated? I thought for sure that the city would clamp down on it. And instead, it spread all over the world and became I don't want to call it an industry in and of itself, because I don't think that this work is itself an industry. I think specifically in-person, on-demand, app-deployed work is defined primarily by the fact that these companies are all engaging in a form of labor arbitrage, violating laws with respect to minimum wage and overtime protections, violating laws with regard to unemployment and workers' comp, and all of these violations of the law in my study really came to a head in the coronavirus pandemic, because for many people who were already living in crisis in my research, the pandemic just became, quadrupled the intensity of their crisis. And so that's sort of a very long-winded answer to your question.
I'll go next. So yeah, my name is Tommy Carden. I'm with Warehouse Workers for Justice, as the lead organizer. I came to this work, as was mentioned, I did ethnographic field work on disabled employees working in sheltered workshops in Chicago, and spent many months talking with workers and really getting to know a lot of disabled workers who are exploited, making sometimes pennies an hour in sheltered workshops in Illinois. And it was personal for me. One of my brothers has Down syndrome, and was invested in making sure that this wasn't the kind of employment that he might have to choose between one day. I came to Warehouse Workers for Justice during the pandemic, and wanted to be in the labor movement, working to build worker power among temporary workers, particularly in warehousing. And many warehouse workers, across the country, but especially in Illinois, are temporary workers, and hope to get into that a bit more later. But just to say a bit more about Warehouse Workers for Justice. We are a worker center fighting for stable living wage jobs, in Illinois' warehouse and distribution industries. And we educate workers on their labor rights, how to enforce their rights, and support workers who are organizing in their workplaces and communities, fighting for policies that can, promote full-time work and decent wages, and move towards a system that doesn't rely on temp labor that exploits, discriminates, and keeps people trapped in poverty. So.
Okay, so for me, my path to this work is extremely personal. And I really look at this work from the intersection of race, class, and gender, having grown up in rural Southwest Mississippi. And as the granddaughter of sharecroppers, and sort of really deeply understanding that the unfairness of our economy, and that if we want to create a just and inclusive economy, we have to actually make policy that takes into account the need of folks who are most vulnerable in this labor market, so workers of color and immigrants. And that over time and over history, we haven't done that. So when my dad was born in 1938, which was after the New Deal was enacted and in full swing, pretty much him and everybody he knew, they were left out of the New Deal because they worked in agriculture and they were domestics. And what's exciting about this work in this moment, and what NELP is working to do, is to center workers of color in the middle, their needs, so they are purposely included. And then we're building the policy around them like a concentric circle, because when the opposite happens, they're often excluded or told you have to wait your turn, or otherwise just either not included, or they're included but their needs aren't included, so they're de facto excluded. So that's what brought me to this work, and it's a really exciting moment with COVID sort of pulling the covers back on a lot of the labor market inequities that have been somewhat submerged and ignored.
So I'm wondering whether the three of you can talk about sort of the particular challenges of dealing with precarious and vulnerable workers, whether they're immigrants, gig workers, or sort of just the sort of particular challenges, and the extent to which COVID has either identified those challenges or made those challenges worse, or whichever portion of that you'd like to talk about.
I can start. I will focus in on worker health and safety. So one of the surprising things to a lot of Americans is how little health and safety protection they have on the job. So essentially, you don't have a private right of action around a safe and healthy workplace. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration is your remedy. And in the prior administration, they were kind of missing in action. And so in the middle of a global pandemic, you have an agency that is not addressing health and safety, not putting in place any mandatory standards around PPE, distancing, or any of those things. And we saw workers losing their lives in jobs that were supposedly essential, but we treated the workers as disposable. And I think one of the big challenges is even when workers speak up, they end up being retaliated against. And their only remedy there is still OSHA. So I think these workers are joining together to build power, but one of their challenges is that corporations have so much more power than they do. And that's been intentional, sort of an undermining of the labor movement over time. So those are the challenges I would say that are really kind of rising to the top right now in this moment.
So I think of a lot, I think of solutions to this problem, not only through a regulatory framework, or the problems that I study, not only through a regulatory framework, but also through an organizing and collective power framework. And so part of what I have, observed, documented, and studied particularly in the on-demand economy, or in on-demand work, has been the problems with organizing. So unlike, say, in a factory or even in a warehouse, which we all have been observing is still very, very difficult to organize folks. In this sort of workforce or in work environment, it's very difficult. Workers are atomized, they're dispersed. Some of them are full-time employees, some full-time workers, or more than full-time workers, many of them. Some of them are more casual workers. And so their interests are really diverged, aside from the fact that they don't have a place to gather and sort of build community and have conversation. And so that has been a huge problem, I think, in mobilizing the kind of power necessary to change things in this environment. Over the last 7 years, there are a lot of strides that have been made by just ingenious workers and their allies who have done things like in LA created an app that they talk about as though it were their water fountain to do organizing and actually do one-on-one organizing with people by phone. So I've also observed some really beautiful ways in which people address, the workers themselves are creating solutions to the problems of organizing in the field. And I would say that with the COVID pandemic, one of the things that I have been sort of most amazed by, I mean, my own study of this community became restricted in so much as I wasn't going to their protests, even though they were continuing to have protests, and interestingly enough, because they were already risking their lives working every day. But what I found that was so inspiring is the way in which, despite, precarity upon precarity, crisis upon crisis, the way workers really came together because of how just disgusted they were with how they were treated. The politics of aid and mutual aid that was created amongst California workers during this time. Some of the workers my friends that I organized with, they were sharing their UI checks with one another as they came in. When the companies told them that they were going to have to buy PPE from the companies, they actually found another company that would donate the PPE to them, and they created these PPE drives called We Got Your Back, where they distributed PPE to their fellow workers and did a lot of political education in the process. And I don't want to sort of glorify that, because it doesn't fix, and it is not a fix. It does not, but just to highlight the ways in which these people who are really facing kinds of crises that are very hard for most of us to sort of wrap our minds around or imagine, have really cultivated relationships, formed beautiful forms of resistance, and found a way to fight back in this context while they're losing the lives of their fellow workers.
I think from the members of Warehouse Workers for Justice and warehouse workers in Illinois, what Rebecca said earlier about retaliation has been a huge obstacle to improving conditions and to organizing during the pandemic. I mean, COVID has just absolutely decimated warehousing in Illinois. There's been, over 210 reported outbreaks since July in factory, manufacturing, warehouse, and distribution center settings, and those are only what's been reported. So many workers have gotten sick, often without quarantine pay. They're not getting hazard pay. In the report we did, based on 90 interviews with warehouse and manufacturing workers in the region, 85% of those workers interviewed, said that their employer either didn't respond to workers' complaints, took action that didn't improve situations in the warehouse with regards to health and safety, or actually retaliated against those who spoke up, right, with concerns about COVID. And some of our workers at one warehouse in Joliet, Illinois, came together and had a petition effort, and we're demanding hazard pay, we're demanding quarantine pay, we're demanding, PPE, which wasn't being given to them at the beginning. They were demanding, adequate sanitation. And over 100, close to 150 workers signed this petition, and shortly after, the 5 leaders of the effort were fired. They were temp workers, and still a lot of right and others, and they themselves were retaliated, and the National Labor Relations Board couldn't find that they were retaliated against, but could find that there were threatening statements made by their supervisors, both from the staffing agency and from the actual company that owns the warehouse. And I think it really, when you look at temp workers, and temp workers have less training and suffer higher rates of injury. They almost never receive benefits, of unpredictable schedules, where assignments could end at any moment, suffer, higher rates of wage theft, sexual harassment, racial discrimination, You know, a lot of these temporary workers, they're not actually temporary workers. They've been temps for 4 or 5 years, right? They're permatemps. So I think the first part of the question, I think, you know, COVID for a lot of temp workers who are living very much paycheck to paycheck, you know, being retaliated against, being fired, having to stay home because of an outbreak or because of themselves or their coworkers getting COVID and not getting paid. You know, things have gotten worse in that sense for a lot of workers, but I think it's also shed a light on things that have been going on for a long time. And a lot of people who haven't been looking at it, you know, it might be more evident now.
So I'm actually teaching labor law right now, and I think as I'm going through, you know, sort of explaining the laws and the processes and the, you know, 8A1 violations and all that, I wonder how useful the law actually is to the types of workers that you're dealing with. My sense is not all that useful, but if you be willing to comment on that, I appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean, with the workers that I study, it's a real hindrance, in fact, because so much of their energy is laying claim to being employees, so that they can be included in the laws, despite the fact that the laws themselves are you know, have limited efficacy at this point with regard to at least collective organizing. You know, we saw yesterday, after 3 years, Elon Musk got a slap on the wrist for his tweet deterring collective organizing in the workplace. Literally was asked to just delete the tweet after 3 years. So I think that what is a struggle with these workers is whether or not to use the law at all, you know, whether to just ignore that they are misclassified and organize collective power regardless, which is very hard for all the reasons that I stated, including that they don't have access to a minimum wage or overtime protections or reimbursements. And so their income is so unpredictable and insecure. Or alternatively, to spend a lot of time and energy directing their work towards not only collective organizing, but also towards litigation, towards legislation. You know, right now, a lot of the ride-hail drivers that are organizing in California are working to get the PRO Act passed. Last week they did a pretty big protest up and down the state of California, urging the Senate to pass the PRO Act because they see it as their ticket to being identified as a real union instead of an undocumented union, which is what they call themselves right now.
I would just say that a big obstacle is not having a universal just cause. So if workers can be fired for any reason or no reason at all, I mean, how can they come together and organize for better, safer working conditions? You know, when workers, when that culture of fear exists, right, workers can be pitted against each other, and you know, when arbitrary firings can be, you know, as widespread as they are, it's a huge obstacle to organizing, and I hear that from workers all the time.
I would say the relationship with the law is fraught. Like Veena was saying, they're often excluded from the law. So, and if we were able to get employee status for these workers, then the law has to be enforced. And how do you make sure that if I'm supposed to get a $15 minimum wage, that I actually get that and it's not stolen from me by the employer? So it's an uphill battle all the way around. And part of why we know that building power is important, because it's not just getting the law passed, but it's also making sure it's implemented correctly, that it's enforced, that it's durable, that it's not just flipped the next time there's a change in the composition of the legislature or the city council. So the relationship to the law is fraught. It's like you're excluded or you're included, but I know you have this right, but make me.
I wonder wondering if you can talk about how issues of race and class are sort of intertwined with the issues facing precarious workers. I'm sort of always interested, you know, during the beginning of the pandemic, we were talking about essential workers, right? As if somehow this was like, right, this is a great group of people. And then of course, the essential workers are the same people who we don't protect sort of generally. So I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about those issues.
I can start. So one of the things that folks don't sort of really intuitively understand about our economy and labor market is that opportunity is segregated in the United States. And there's double penalties for women of color because of gender and race. And, you know, if you take into account educational attainment, 87% of occupations in the US can be classified as racially segregated. But on the flip side, we say that America is a country where if you work hard, you can succeed. But we have all of these structural things that are in the way that are preventing people from succeeding. So I would say that the intersection with class and race is that you don't have the power to expect or ask for certain things in your job. Like all of us are probably able to work from home, but how do you get that if you don't have the power? And so I think like we have to get to a place where it's unacceptable that so many of us can be treated this way, that we act as if the market is going to take care of them, and when the government has these policy levers and we should be using them. So if we want them to have better wages, we need to raise the minimum wage. And that is the thing that we need to focus on is understanding what caused all of this and that we have the power to change it. And do we have the will to change it is the question.
Yeah, I mean, I have a very long-winded response, just building on everything that Rebecca really beautifully articulated. And maybe I can embed the question in an example. So we know in the US that, at least by the Lyft's own statistics, that at least 69% of their national workforce identifies as racial minority. So it's sort of, you know, in the Bay Area, we know that there is 78% of people who do this work that is carved out of any protections is immigrant or racial minority. And so it truly is a, you know, it doesn't take an intellect and many intellectual leaps to say that people are doing this work as Rebecca articulated, because other opportunities are really limited to them. These are people who are very much on the margins of the labor market. That said, I think it's important to note how this reality has been weaponized by the capitalists, by the companies themselves. So most recently in California, we lost a really big battle to a $205 million proposition campaign paid for by Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, Instacart, and Postmates. And what that battle did was, that law did was essentially overturn what the legislature, what the attorney general, what two different lower court and appellate court had decided, which was that these workers need and legally are eligible to receive the protections of state employment law. And it created a new category of worker. This is Proposition 22, created for the first time in US law, a category of worker that is called the network delivery worker, a transportation network worker, delivery network worker, and a whole new set of employment protections for these workers. But what these protections, you know, supposed protections really did was cement the business model. But in the process of getting this law passed in a democratic state that is the most diverse and unequal state in the country, the companies did two things. They relied, and the two things were very interrelated and intertwined. They relied heavily on misinformation. So they really, I think it's fair to say deceived or at least confused the electorate by continuing to say that these were new benefits, these were going to improve the work, and that workers were going to get 120% of the minimum wage. What they didn't say is that 120% of the minimum wage was only going to be paid to workers after they had received a fare, which essentially made this piecework that is unpredictable and that continues to, for some people, mean that they go home with nothing in their pocket, because it all depends on how much work they're allocated by algorithm and what demand is like. And so in the context of Prop 22, post Prop 22 now, some in the delivery network, some delivery network workers have been noting that as they reach their engaged time threshold, so you have to do 30 hours of engaged time in order to get, for example, healthcare subsidies, the app, their boss app stops allocating work to them so that they cannot get the supposed benefits that are in, that were passed in Proposition 22. But the second thing that the companies did to pass this law, which I think was so insidious and relevant to your question about race and class, is they sort of ensconced themselves in a rhetoric of racial benevolence. So they said, as I will say, the industrialists did in the 1930s when the New Deal was being passed, when the first sort of iteration of the Fair Labor Standards Act was passed with the National Recovery Act, or National Recovery Agency. They said, look, if we have to raise the wages of these workers, then we're just going to lay them all off. So this is actually going to prohibit, this is actually going to be really bad for these workers. They're going to lose, the hundreds of thousands of people are going to be losing their jobs. So all of a sudden, these were jobs and not gigs for the purposes of this argument. Thousands of people are going to be losing their jobs. And look, the single Black mother and the Latinx father all depend on this work. Like how could you even suggest that these workers deserve employment protections? And it was that argument and I think the ways in which they insidiously used imagery and the voices of people of color in really precarious situations that facilitated the rubber stamp from the California NAACP, from the National Action Network in Sacramento. I mean, there was a lot of division within the civil rights community. Also, soon after Prop 22 passed, the president of the California NAACP, Alice Huffman, was actually resigned as a result of her positions, I think, on these propositions. But there was, it was all about racial benevolence. It was all about how these workers they need this work. And it's similar to the arguments that people make about raising the minimum wage. You raise the minimum wage, we're going to have to lay off all the poor people. And the weaponization of race was just to witness it was stark and quite infuriating.
I think when we talked about essential workers, and I think something comes to mind talking to a worker who asked me, if I'm so essential, right, why am I 50 years old and only making $12 an hour? And he's a temp worker. And in Illinois, right, like in the warehouses, there's like, not just in the warehouses, but across the state, there's 680,000 temp workers. And 85% of them are workers of color. And only 35% of the workforce in Illinois are workers of color. So crazy disproportionate rates of Black and brown workers, in these temp jobs. They're doing the same. They're doing similar warehouse work, oftentimes the same exact warehouse work next to workers who might be direct hires making more, and they're receiving 40% less pay. And like only about, I think 12% of them have health insurance. So you see how people get, you see the relationship there between race and class, and how people are, like the worker I talked to, have been trapped in these jobs for 20-ish years. And what's even more infuriating is that a lot of where I am in Will County, Illinois, and in the Chicagoland area, a lot of some of the biggest Fortune 500 companies, major corporations, their supply chains run through here, and they rely on temp labor, right? And you look at some of these companies that have done remarkably well during the pandemic, right? Increased their profits dramatically, and they rely on temp labor, and say they can't pay their workers more, and that's a great source of frustration and anger, and has fueled a lot of workers who are trying to come together and organize during the pandemic, looking at like the profits of Jeff Bezos and Amazon growing exponentially, while conditions there are clearly so poor.
So I was thinking when talking about the analogies between the protection for gig workers, are they going to be employed or not, and the sort of minimum wage issues. I mean, how do you combat that? Because I'm hearing it now, right? We can't raise the minimum wage because that's going to be terrible. The people that are going to suffer, the poor people, the foot of all those. How do you combat that? I mean, is there a way to do it? I face a question when I'm teaching about it, right? And sort of trying to figure out what the right response is to those sort of arguments.
Well, the data doesn't bear it out that there's a lot of job loss. I mean, there's 21 states and localities that are paying above minimum wage, and it's rising every year, and they're not having this happen to them. And in some cases, things are better in places that are paying higher wages. So I think, calling BS on it is one thing that can be done, in terms of the fact that it's not true. But I think also we should be thinking about, like, the opportunity to exploit someone or to be exploited is not an opportunity. So if the only way you can offer me a job is to exploit me, then don't offer me a job, right? So, but it's like what Tommy was saying, we know that they're making a lot of money and that their stakeholders are their shareholders, and the community is not a stakeholder, their workers are not a stakeholder. It's all about shareholder value and a certain percentage of the population getting richer at the expense and on the backs of these other workers.
Yeah, I mean, I think at this point in the economy that we are in, with what has happened in the last year, with the vast inequality that we are seeing, inequality that we haven't seen in a century. I think if people who are making those arguments are just are not looking around them. And to Rebecca's point about the data, the economics data is mixed, but interestingly, more recently, there's been a lot of really good, rigorous work suggesting that, in fact, despite the same fight going on and on and on for decades about the minimum wage, that in fact there is either no job loss or very little. And so I think it's to point out that, what the workers that I study try and point out, and in fact did a beautiful protest in front of Dara Khosrowshahi's house, tried to point out where the money is being allocated. So it's not that you can't pay these workers, it's that you're choosing to pay your CEO this much. It's that you're choosing to literally pay hundreds of social scientists and data scientists to make it look like you don't control your workforce, so you don't have to pay the minimum wage, rather than just providing minimum wage and overtime and predictability of pay. It is such a frustrating conversation to have, because it just seems so obvious and so stark, particularly in this moment.
I would add to the high the increase in profits, right, during the pandemic. I would also add the level of tax, the tax breaks that a lot of these corporations have gotten to build in Illinois. I mean, in a lot of very small towns. Elwood, Illinois, has a population of just over 2,000. And they agreed to tax abatement for many of the warehouses that have been developed in the past 5 to 10 years. And the city's $30 million in debt. Amazon in Northeastern Illinois, they have received over, I think, the past 5 years, like $740 million in taxpayer funded incentives. So I think our workers are agitating around that. And well, if you if all those tax breaks were given to you, what's the justification for the wages being low, in addition to the massive profits you've made during?
So are there things that I should be asking, that is questions, that things you want to talk about that I've not asked you about? Okay, well, I just want to make sure. So can you talk sort of about sort of the broader, I guess, connection between empowering precarious gig workers, immigrant workers, and sort of racial, social, economic justice, right? Sort of where does, we've touched on some of those issues, but I'm sort of thinking about how this fits into some of those broader justice issues.
I don't know that this responds specifically to your question, but I always like to think about the real importance of from a solidarity perspective and an organizing perspective, really thinking about the intertwining of civil and labor rights. And I think that, one of the things that we really failed to do in California during Proposition 22, my feeling was that the labor movement didn't have the existing connections with the civil rights community. And that was a huge failure. It was a real problem that we didn't have these connections. And I took part in fighting the proposition, and I used to do civil rights work, and I went to the various immigrant rights and civil rights organizations that I used to work with, and I was surprised that the issues, it was surprising to me that the issues weren't crystal clear. And of course they weren't crystal clear because our work in many ways is so siloed, like we become experts in particular things and we organize around particular things. And even though those things felt and experienced by the same person in this body, the communities that are doing the organizing are sometimes very different. And I always think about how, Philip Randolph was the labor unionist that conceived the March on Washington for jobs and freedom, and how perverse it was that, and particularly in part because of the exclusion of African-American workers from the New Deal and the exclusion of those workers from defense jobs in World War II. And I always think, during the last march, you had Uber and Lyft and DoorDash talking about how they supported the march on Washington, the commemorative march, and how perverse that was, and why was it possible that they were able to do this without everyone like rolling their eyes or just rejecting it. And I think it's a failure in large part of organizing, to think more critically about how the laws might silo these issues, but our organizing really has to bring them together.
I would weigh in and say that part of social justice is like, what is the promise of this country? And the promise of this country is that if you work hard, you're going to be successful. And on the other side, that we believe in equal opportunity. And I think that the missing piece is outcomes. So not just opportunity. Don't just take down a barrier, like make sure I can actually take advantage of whatever it is you're taking down the barrier for, and that we don't do that. And so our remedies are really kind of targeted to someone who has very little barriers. Maybe they have one barrier and you take that down and they can take advantage of whatever the opportunity is. But we really need to be making policy with people's needs in mind, and that the policy needs to be inclusive of the needs of everybody we're trying to reach, and not just sort of the ideal person who has very little in the way of challenges. And if you look at the New Deal, that was designed for the ideal worker, people with very little in the way of challenges. And because it was designed for that group, that's who it worked for. And if you fast forward to now, programs like the Unemployment Insurance Benefits Program have not been modernized to include these workers. Thankfully, there were changes made in the Recovery Act that brought in these workers in these precarious jobs, but prior to that, they weren't included. And so we actually need to update our policies and I think either like live up to what we're saying the country is about, or stop saying that's what the country is about.
Yeah, I would just add to that right, so many low-wage workers working in warehousing and distribution, they just don't have time to do anything else, or have emotional energy to do anything else. A lot of the workers, they work, very long shifts, they make nothing, and they're taking, oftentimes, if they don't have a car, or transportation is too expensive, they take staffing agency vans an hour out of the city of Chicago to work, right, in these warehouses. So I think, right, the workers who are here all the time, people like, I'm doing everything right, I'm working really hard, I'm putting in the work, my back kills, this job is grueling, but are barely, are barely able to make it and scrape by. So I think without those things being addressed, I think, like, without the precarious situation that a lot of these workers live in, they just don't have time to focus on anything else, right? Because that's the constant worry, that's the constant drive, is how to put food on the table and take care of their kids or grandkids. So
I was thinking of the difference between equality and equity, right? Sort of some of the questions and some of the political fallback as soon as you start talking about, right, equity versus equality. Megan, do you?
Yeah, I'm moving on just so we can have a little bit of time to raise up some questions from the Q&A. And we have one that I think it specifically goes to Veena, but anyone else is welcome to chime in. What are methods that are most effective for stopping the Prop 2 model from spreading to other states?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about this, and I'm actually putting together like a one-pager because it is already spreading to other states. So just from our experiences in California. So this was not they don't have a lot of arguments, right? Like they say three things, and all of those three things are very defeatable. They say, oh, thousands of workers are going to lose their jobs. Well, in fact, their own data on this is telling, 60 to 70% of people, according to their own data, leave the job after 6 months. There is high rates of driver churn, and that was when the wages were much higher in 2016. And so they include in their numbers of people who are supposedly going to lose their jobs, people who have already self-exited the market. And in fact, we know that something like 80% of the work done on these or for these companies, for these quote unquote app-based companies, is done by drivers who are working full-time and more than full-time. So that's, I think, one important sort of argument to make. And then they say, oh, but this is really flexible work, and all these people need flexibility. And I think we really have to hone in on the fact that there is nothing about employment that prohibits flexibility. This is about benefits. These are about getting access to the minimum wage, having overtime, how the companies structure their workforce is a decision that the companies make, but they would really lose their entire workforce, I think, if they completely took away scheduling flexibility, because many of these people do need and rely on it. And the third argument, I sort of discussed with regard to the racial identity of their workers and how insidious this is. I don't think that this model would pass in a legislature because it is so incredibly exploitative, although they are already trying. We hear rumblings of it in Connecticut and Illinois. They've tried to introduce something similar in Canada in response to the UK Supreme Court telling them that their drivers are workers who need to get paid for all the time they spend laboring. They implemented a similar Prop 22 type model. And so I think that the most effective method at this point is both organizing on the ground, forming the kinds of solidarities that I spoke about. So really creating power to oppose these things, and then enforcement. You know, we are in a moment where we have a Democratic president who's very invested in workers' rights. We have more power in the Senate. I'm really hopeful that this will be a moment where we see more robust enforcement and a putting an end to this piecework economy.
And then I wanted to lift up another question that got sent to me, but I think when you're in the labor movement, you kind of have to be a dreamer, and you have to be able to have this transformative imagination that sees beyond the, I apologize, my coffee pot is making noise in the background. You have to have this like imagination that can see beyond the economy that we all currently live with. So I wanted to give you all a chance to talk about how you imagine like long form material change for the workers that are in your purview, and then also what immediate material relief could look like at the same time.
One thing to lift up about this is the ability to organize. So the ability for workers to form a union, that has been curtailed over time. So we do have policy levers that we've used to curtail that. And without that, it's really hard to build the power. I mean, unions don't just work and help with workplace democracy, they also help with democracy writ large. So one of the things in the works is the PRO Act, which would deliver collective bargaining rights to many workers who currently don't have the ability to organize. As Veena mentioned earlier, this administration is putting the brakes on and reversing some of the prior administration's rules that were kind of in support of what Uber and Lyft are trying to accomplish. And so there's the ability to unionize and bring standards across industries is vital to what we.
I have to build on what Rebecca articulated, which I wholeheartedly agree and share that perspective and that vision. I just to think, you know, part of the joy of being an academic is I can think about things that are, imagine things that are sort of you know, far away, but could be possibilities. And I think a lot about the possibility of having these sort of community-centered centers that are spaces for recreation, but also, you know, like union halls, but also places for organizing and building power, and maybe also serve as like a place for like health, well-being, and that these would somehow be like, you know, either state sponsored or union sponsored. But I think a lot about, you know, in order for, even if we have the rights, even if workers have the rights to organize, what is critically missing is the ability to form community, and how important community and friendship and relationships are to really long-term organizing, and not just long-term organizing, but cultivation of power in the long term. And so what would make that possible? And I think that the kinds of institutions that would make that possible are really few and far between today. You know, we don't have a lot of union halls. We don't have, those union halls are not necessarily places where everyone feels comfortable. I think that we should think about or envision, in addition to making the law right, making the community right, and thinking about places where we could do that.
Okay. And then I just want to lift up one last question that I got, which is, I think for a lot of us, so a number of the people who are here today are lawyers and or law students, and law often teaches you this language of constraint for what you're able to work within. But it's also a lot about convincing people of your story. What have you seen as really, really effective tactics for messaging the vision that you all are articulating?
I think that there's been a lot of attention lately to narrative. So what are the narratives that we're operating under in our economy? And some things that are seeming to break through with those narratives. So one narrative was that we're a post-racial society, right? Race doesn't matter, everybody's got equal opportunities. This was particularly insidious after Obama and during Obama. But, you know, shining a light on, now everyone has a computer that has a camera and a video on it in their pocket. And so when we see the state sanction violence against Black bodies and of that nature, the narrative changes. And so part of our job is figuring out what those narratives are and changing them, because that creates the space for there to be policy change that's durable. You can win policy change without changing the narrative, and the policy is really ineffective or, you know, excludes lots of folks.
Well, I would say one of the things I like the most about working with a worker center, particularly Warehouse Workers for Justice, is that I think we try as often to be worker-led as as possible, not staff-led. And for the messages, right, like letting the workers speak for themselves, like taking the cues as an organization from what the workers are demanding, what the workers want, what the workers need. And just in a quick anecdote, during the pandemic, especially, I've seen the enormous power that it can have when a worker who isn't used to sharing their story, sharing their testimony does, and sort of how that has, worked to help kind of develop that worker into a leader. We have one worker who has been exploited his whole life and is close to 60 and has worked, I think about 12 different temp jobs in the past 5 or 6 years. But there was an opportunity for him to speak about his experience during the pandemic at an event, and he hadn't done it. And he was really, really nervous and didn't know what to say. And, story down, and it was an opportunity for him to share who he was and think through what he was demanding and what he wanted to see, what the vision he wanted to achieve in the warehousing industry. Now he's part of our organization as a community navigator. He's really invested and I think empowered by the experience of sharing his story repeatedly and seeing that move others to action in his workplace and in other places. So I think, as far as communicating what I've been saying and what we've been saying, I think as an organization trying to let the workers speak for themselves and provide opportunities for the workers to share their stories and to move others to action. Yeah.
I guess I would add, and I don't know how helpful this is, but I've been struck particularly amongst my students who are really much more, good, sometimes 15 years younger than me, but very much more knowledgeable about the world and inequality and issues than I was when I was their age and in their position. And I sometimes think this in relationship to the way that the mediums through which people get information. So not just always making sure that it is actually the impacted communities whose narratives are being put forth, but also the access that people have through different mediums to receive those messages. Rebecca mentioned how impactful seeing police violence has been in allowing people to believe that police violence is a problem. And sometimes I feel, when I think about this, it makes me feel a little bit overwhelmed because I don't know how to use TikTok, I don't know how to use Instagram, and I don't, I don't look at YouTube, and there's certainly a lot of, you know, of really dangerous right-wing propaganda that exists in those social media spaces that we have to be wary of. But I kind of think that there are a lot of really cool things that are being done by different young and upcoming activists that involve reaching people through easy mediums like TikTok. And I find that exciting and sort of interesting, and have been trying to think more creatively myself. You know, I'm probably not going to have a TikTok account anytime soon. But that is, I have been surprised in my classes to hear my students talk about the ways in which they've been politicized. So I just to emphasize that I don't think it's just the voices, but also the medium through which the voices are shared that we should be thinking about.
Well, thank you all so much. We're about at time. So just on behalf of the entire managing board, really want to thank you we know that time and energy are really precious, and they're privileges when you choose to share some of yours with any person. So we're really just thankful that you're willing to share some of yours with us to educate the community that we have here today. These are really vital conversations, and we're really glad that you could be here to be in conversation with us. Thank you all. Thank you, Professor Hébert, for moderating.
Thank you. Thank you for, you've been so incredibly organized and amazing. And thank you for this forum to have this conversation with these amazing panelists.
Great. Well, thank you.
Some great conversations, some great panels.
Okay, so you all are welcome to hop off whenever you want or stay for the rest of the symposium, totally up to you. Everybody else, so we're going to take like a 15-minute break to just, you know, take a stretch break before we have our next panel. It is going to be on prison labor and sex work. And yeah, we will meet you all back here at 3:45 Eastern. Thanks.